So I mentioned that the Parti Autonomiste Breton, the Breton Autonomy Party, was established in 1927, but in some ways it was divided by the same political divisions that were tearing Europe apart in the 1930s between left-wing and right-wing politics. So Olivier Modrel founded the party with Maurice Duhamel. Duhamel was very much left-leaning Breton nationalist. He wanted the Bretons to collaborate with the Communist Party, for example. And just to give you here, so this is a quote from Duhamel. He says, current status of Europe is outdated. Essentially what he's calling for is greater federalization within the nation-states of Europe to recognize the various regional nationalities that they have, that it's a more kind of loose approach to borders, and a federalization is the way to go. So he wasn't really calling for Breton independence as such. And that meant he was quite different from people like Olivier Modrel, who very much were calling for Breton independence. And the Breton Autonomy Party split in the 1930s between this kind of left-wing faction led by Duhamel, pictured here, and Olivier Modrel, who very much adopted more right-wing views, certainly was no fan of the Communist Party. But over time had also begun to adopt some of the kind of language being used by Adolf Hitler in Germany. In particular, Adolf Hitler's idea of a clear racial hierarchy in which the Nazis or the Aryan people were on top, that appealed to Modrel, and Modrel began to imagine his own kind of racial hierarchy where the Bretons effectively were part of the Aryan race as well. And some of his language also adopted some of the anti-Semitism of Adolf Hitler, for example. So in an article he published in the Breton Journal in 1932, he said that the word Jacobin rhymes with the word Yid, which it does in French, and as a way of equating the centralized French state with Judaism. And of course, in Modrel's mind, these were the two enemies of the Breton nation. And so Modrel was kind of foreshadowing some of the collaboration we're going to see with Breton nationalists and the Nazis during the Second World War. Nor was he the only one who was kind of interested in German politics and German influence on potential influence on Brittany. Célestine Lainé was a Breton nationalist. He was inspired by the Irish Republican Army and its campaign against the British Army during the Irish War of Independence, and believed that the youth of Brittany could do the same thing in establishing a paramilitary guerrilla organization to overthrow French rule. So in 1931, he established an organization called Gwen et Du, the Black and White. And black and white actually refers to the flag of Brittany. The flag of Brittany itself had only been created in 1923 by another nationalist. And if it looks a little bit familiar to you, it's because it was modelled in some ways on the United States flag, which its creator felt the United States was a symbol of freedom, and therefore was an appropriate symbol for Breton nationalism as well. So this is the Breton flag today. So you get the sense that many of these emblems of Breton nationalism were kind of created in the early 20th century. The most notorious act of Lainé's Gwen et Du movement was to target the statue here of Anne of Brittany and Charles VIII, which seems controversial. And in 1932, Lainé destroyed the sculpture, put a bomb beside it and blew it up so that it doesn't actually remain in reign anymore. He continued to get so for over the next 15 years, Lainé continued to promote this paramilitary organization of Breton nationalism to use physical force to overthrow French control of Brittany. It kind of changes names from time to time because he constantly kind of reinvents it. But he usually had a couple of hundred members at any time over the course of the 1930s and 1940s. Of course, the big change in French politics in the 1930s is the rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and that actually changes things for Breton nationalists. So for us in the 1920s, even early 1930s, the French state could largely afford to ignore the Breton nationalists because they didn't have much political support. They could be just kind of seen as a minor irritant rather than a real threat to the French state. But by the late 1930s, the French government is becoming much more concerned about potential fifth columns within France who could act to assist in a German invasion of France. In 1938, the French government passed a law making it illegal to question the territorial integrity of France. And this obviously affected Breton nationalists who were advocating independence for Brittany. So both Mordrel and de Beaufils were arrested and spent time in prison. They were released in 1939, and then they fled the country. They made their way to Amsterdam, and once the war broke out between Germany and France, both Mordrel and de Beaufils began advocating collaboration with the Germans for the Bretons, encouraging Bretons who'd been enlisted in the French army to desert, and promoting the idea of collaboration between the French and the Nazis. The French state obviously paid attention to this. And in early 1940, Mordrel and de Beaufils were both sentenced to death in absentia for treason. And so for them, they suddenly became very dependent upon a German victory during the war in order to kind of have any normal life back home in Brittany if they wanted to ever go back. However, in the short term, their kind of prayers were answered in that the Nazi blitzkrieg launched in May of 1940 overwhelmed the French state. France was obviously defeated by June of 1940, and that meant that Mordrel and de Beaufils were able to return to Brittany. And they had begun working with the Nazis, who at least initially were open to the prospect of and it's worth bearing this in mind that even the Nazis themselves in 1940 did not understand that the war was going to go on for 4 or 5 more years. The Nazis were interested in the idea of breaking France up into a series of small states, and so initially were willing to kind of work with the Breton nationalists, allow them to establish something called the Breton National Committee. And so de Beaufils and Mordrel returned to Brittany in July of 1940. They established a new newspaper, Le Bretonais, the Breton Times, which begins publishing and oftentimes pro-Breton and certainly pro-Nazi propaganda in order to ingratiate themselves with the Nazis, with the hope that once the war was over, the Nazis would actually recognize Breton national identity. And actually the Nazis did appoint a governor over the 5 historical regions that made up Brittany, and the Bretons took this as a sign that the Nazis were willing to work with them. Although, as time went on, the Nazis' attitude towards this kind of changed. Breton nationalists had different ideas about what to do regarding the new political situation. Francois Gaffreneau, who I mentioned, had fought for the French during the First World War. He was not a fan of the Nazi invasion, but he believed that collaborating with the Vichy government was the best way to kind of preserve Breton's distinct national identity. So for a time, he served as a cultural advisor to the Vichy government on Breton affairs. However, in the middle of the war, he went about an amazing kind of about-face and began instead advocating for Breton independence, which he had not advocated for in the earlier decades, and began even writing for Le Hurrah Breton, that is the pro-Nazi newspaper set up by Mordrel. Mordrel himself came into a political dispute. So one of the early divisions between, so on the left we have here Mordrel, on the right we have Célestine Lainé, who's wearing an SS uniform, which I'll talk more about in a moment. They had a falling out because Mordrel believed that Vichy France was the enemy of Brittany. He was concerned, correctly, that the Germans were sympathizing, basically didn't want to piss off the Vichy government, and therefore stopped kind of entertaining the kind of ideas of some recognition of Breton nationalism. Whereas Lainé and most of the Breton nationalists figured the only way we're going to get an independent Breton state is if we work with the Nazis. Attacking the Vichy government, like Mordrel was trying to do, didn't serve their long-term interests at all. And so in November 1940, Lainé organised a coup against Mordrel, who was the head of the Breton National Committee, and he was pushed out. So for going forward, the Breton national movement sought to work with the Vichy government and the Nazis in order to kind of promote some move towards Breton independence. Lainé was a big admirer of the German Nazi movement as well. He basically wanted to create an organization that kind of mirrored the Hitler Youth as a way of kind of training the youth of Brittany to in military tactics and in soldiery life to prepare them to fight for Breton independence. So he called for the creation of something like a Hitler Youth, and one of the men who took up his call was Yann Fouéré, who was a Breton nationalist who had been part of Lainé's Gwen Edu black and white movement of the 1930s. And Goulet established something called the Bagadou Storum, which essentially means the piper unit, and it was referred to. So there's a type of Breton bagpipe that looks a little bit like the Scottish bagpipes, and that's what the name was kind of referring to. And you see the symbol here; they have the Celtic Triskelion in the middle, which is an old Celtic symbol, but also it's not that hard to see how it kind of looks a bit like a swastika, so that was chosen as their symbol. The uniform of the Bagadou Storum is pictured here on the left, and they very much modelled themselves on the SS, wore black uniforms, apart from the armband, which had the Triskelion symbol, and they also had a couple of tartan stripes in their beret, kind of emphasising the kind of Scottish or Celtic connection. Again, and at its height, the Bagadou Storum had several hundred members. Indeed, for a time, Lainé advocated that they change their name to the Stradelau Storum, because that meant their initials would be SS, and he liked the fact that mirrored the Nazi SS. The kind of big change that comes in the nature of Breton nationalism in France during the war is with the German invasion of Russia in the Soviet Union in 1941. As I mentioned in our earlier class, that also created a new change in dynamics of France, because essentially the Communist Party began actively participating in the resistance movement of France and became much more aggressive in targeting not just Nazis but also pro-Nazi sympathizers, which meant that Breton nationalists were seen as fair game by the Communist Party and members of the resistance. One of the most famous Breton nationalists was a Catholic priest, Jean-Marie Perrault, who was a supporter of the Bagadou Storum, who was suspected of collaborating secretly with the Nazis. And in 1943, he was assassinated by the Communist Party. Lainé had renamed his paramilitary organization once again by 1942 to the Breton Army, and after the assassination of Perrault, he renamed it the Maison Perrault, which means the Perrault unit. So renamed this pro-Nazi paramilitary organization he had after Perrault, and in fact, so trusted was Lainé and his organization that they were co-opted into the SS officially and given SS uniforms, and were some of the last Nazi fighters to surrender in 1943. So Lainé went full Nazi in that sense and really collaborated with the German government. It should be borne in mind that there were Breton nationalists who also participated in the resistance. This is a member of some of the Breton resistance in Brittany, and you can see the fact they are fighting on the one hand with the resistance movement, but also flying the Breton flag and taking pride in their Breton identity. In fact, some members even of the Bagadou Storum switched sides over the course of the war and began participating in resistance activities as well. The most obvious or the most kind of vocal of the Breton resistance members was Yann Fouéré, who was in London with the Gauls Free French movement, who tried to establish a newsletter to encourage Bretons to respect the authority of the Gaul as the leader of France, but at the same time doing so in the hope that the Gaul would recognise if not Breton independence after war, certainly do more to recognise and support the regional and cultural identity of Brittany. So most of the most prominent Breton nationalists certainly collaborated with the Nazis, and there were some who did not, although it's worth bearing in mind that the average Breton nationalist, it was really only the kind of high-profile members like Lainé and Mordrel who actively collaborated. Not all Breton nationalists did, and certainly there were some involved in the resistance as well. So after the war, what happened to these guys? Mordrel was captured by Americans in 1945, who basically allowed him to escape because they were aware he was being sentenced to death in France, and actually was resentenced to death in 1945. He basically told the Americans everything he knew about the Nazi war effort, and then was allowed to escape to Spain. He eventually returned to France in the 1970s. Lainé also resentenced to death. He managed to escape and make his way to Ireland, where he lived for the rest of his life. Yann Fouéré, pictured in the bottom left, who was the guy who established the Bagadou Storum, also escaped to Ireland, and actually, unlike Lainé, had a very, very successful career as a sculptor and and artists. Some of the most famous sculptors in Ireland in the second half of the 20th century were the work of Yann Fouéré, and Francois Jaffrenaud was given a 5-year sentence for collaborating with the Vichy government, but he was actually pardoned in 1946. So the great Breton effort to collaborate with the Nazis ultimately fails because the Nazis are defeated during the Second World War.